This event is in honor of Women's History Month. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of our outstanding female trustees who I see in the audience tonight. Sheila Snow, can you wave your hand? And our board president, Hillary Burkemper. Raise your hand. Thank you both for supporting and for your work to uplift women. And I don't see her tonight, but I would like to say a big thank you to Betsy Green, who is the sponsor of tonight's event. A big thank you for her work as well. And the last woman that I would like to acknowledge tonight is our speaker, Cheri Rae. 2 words best describe the direction of Cheri Rae's writing career: worthy causes. After graduating from California State Northridge with a degree in political science, Cheri embarked on a path of good works that blended her desire to make a difference and her considerable editorial skills. Ardent civic activist and award-winning newspaper columnist and magazine editor, Cheri has long blended her resolve to preserve Santa Barbara's unique environment and architecture with her persuasive writing. Channeling her inner Pearl, she's led successful efforts to preserve the city's Bungalow Haven neighborhood, historic buildings, and countless trees. Rae serves on the board of the Pearl Chase Society and is the longtime editor of The Capital, the organization's newsletter. She is the author of Dyslexia Land, a field guide for parents of children with dyslexia, and Walk Santa Barbara, city strolls and county rambles, as well as Pearl Chase, First Lady of Santa Barbara. This little book here. Tonight, Cheri will be presenting on her latest book, A String of Pearls, Pearl Chase of Santa Barbara. Without further ado, Cheri Rae.
Thank you. Thank you for a lovely introduction. Thank you so much for all being here in the rain and the cold weather. But we're here for Pearl because it's Women's History Month and she deserves this. So thank you for being here. Well, I wanted to, because the book is a different approach to Pearl Chase, I wanted to tell stories about the women who influenced her life. So we're going to take just a little slice of Pearl's life and take a look at it and the wonderful women that were friends of hers and good influences to her good work. A little bit about my professional background. These are some of the books that I've written. I worked for a magazine called California Scenic, and I did the newsletter for the late, great Earthling bookshop. So I got very grounded in Santa Barbara. I moved here in 1989 and got very interested in Pearl Chase from the beginning. Walk Santa Barbara was my first research project about Santa Barbara, and I heard about this woman, and she just intrigued me. And so the Death Valley book is a WPA guide from 1938, and I republished that. So I've just had this dabbling interest in California history, and particularly women. I used to write for Women's Sports and Fitness. So that's, yeah. So, and back when the LA Times was a really good newspaper, I used to do these wonderful stories for this great section called View. And it was a Saturday morning. It was like a full pager. It was so cool. There's Route 66 and several other California history kind of things. So that's how I kind of got a little bit interested in Pearl Chase. And then I went to a museum show in 2004. It was curated by Maria Shriver, and it was about California's remarkable women. And I was very excited about it. It was up in Sacramento, obviously. And we went up there, and I'm like, yay, we're going to go. And the first exhibit that was in the show was of Juicy Couture. And I'm like, oh, how remarkable. And then there was Peggy Fleming and her gold medal, and there was Sally Ride, and that was nice. but Pearl was nowhere to be found. And I just found that really upsetting. And they actually had a computer that you could type in, if you wanted to add someone to the list. And so I suggested that they add her, but they never did. And now it's not, it was going to be a museum of women, and that got very controversial, and now it's not. And I don't know exactly what they're doing with it now. But anyway, Pearl wasn't a part of it. That bothered me. And about the same time, I started doing the newsletter for the Pearl Chase Society. I wasn't a board member, I just did it as a writer. And I heard a lot of people would come to the Pearl Chase Society and share their stories and ask for grants. And I thought that was really great, and it was wonderful. It was wonderful of the society to be able to provide grants. But it bothered me that nobody that came there ever acknowledged her. I didn't think they knew anything about her. And so that got me on this little thing. And at the time, my husband writes hiking books, and he was doing these little mini books. And I couldn't convince him to let me do an actual book. He's the publisher. So I call this the Dinky Book. And this is like really an embarrassment to me at this point, because I knew at the time that she deserved a real book and a real biography. This is not it. This was just like an overview of her life and all of her great accomplishments and her awards and everything. But it's really small, and somebody wrote a review on Amazon and said, "This is a lovely little coffee table book for a very small coffee table." I thought that was so great. But anyway, I'm kind of embarrassed about this. And I always thought after this was like, well, somebody's going to write a biography of Pearl Chase. Somebody will. So I gave a little head start here. Tourists like this book a lot, but nobody ever did. And that made me go out and decide, okay, I'm actually going to really do this. And so I committed to it, and I decided, okay, going out to the university, and I'm going to really learn who this woman was behind this community icon we've all heard about. Who was she? So in my research at UCSB, I found several times she had written this list of qualities, and it's absolute unselfishness, even self-sacrifice is necessary, be farsighted and alert, tremendously enthusiastic, forceful, entirely original, and lovable. And that's a pretty wonderful set of qualities to aspire to. And that just intrigued me that she had written it so many times. And I went through, I cannot tell you how many boxes of her materials. And I found these notes, more than one. So I think, those were her affirmations, I guess. And so anyway, it's kind of a lot to aspire to. So we're going to start now, take a look at some of the women who inspired her. Now, of course, she did not know her maternal grandmother, Maria Wheeler Dempsey. Maria was widowed before Pearl's mother was born. She was 3 months pregnant when her husband, the Reverend Hugh Dempsey, his horse crashed into a tree, and it killed him in a terrible accident. And at the time, Maria had 3 boys and then was expecting Nina. And she was a very strong-willed woman, and she really kept it together and raised these children. Her older son died of tetanus after an accident in a factory. And she managed to continue on. She married again, and she kept the kids together and had them really care for each other. And since the boys were older, as they grew, they helped take care of Nina. They provided for her private education. She was very gifted as a musician, and so they paid for her to go to New England Music Conservatory. And later on, in 1900, the children wrote, didn't write, they commissioned this stained glass window. It's at the church, it's the First Baptist Church in Jay, Maine, and at the very bottom, you can see there's like a banner there. It says, "In memoriam, Reverend Hugh Dempsey, pastor of this church from 1852 to 1859, by his children." So I think that Nina, even though she grew up without a father, and there's this tragedy that we're going to find kind of goes through the family for years. she had a very strong will, just like her mother did. So Nina was, as I mentioned, she was very gifted. She had actually come to Santa Barbara in 1885. Her uncle was C.C. Wheeler, who was the manager of the Arlington Hotel, and she really enjoyed Santa Barbara and spent some time out in the foothills and got to know it a bit, and then married her husband, and his name was Hezekiah Chase, and Hezekiah had a number of health issues. He had to give up his scholarship to MIT when his father was blinded. His father was a very wealthy entrepreneur. He had mercantile business, and he had a patent for a kind of a shoe fastener that made him very, very wealthy. The family was wealthy, but when Hezekiah took over the family business, he was young and inexperienced, and he pretty much lost the family fortune. So he also had an industrial accident, another accident in the family, and a heavy door fell on him. And so he had many health issues that forced the family to go to Europe to try to get him, take the waters, actually. So Nina and Hezekiah left Pearl and her brother Harold, left them with a nurse, and they traveled the world trying to get him healthy again. And then he actually spent time in Dansville Sanitarium, which is where Frederick Douglass was, and Clara Barton were two of the famous people. So they had some money, obviously. And so anyway, that was a lot. But the woman, she had this inner strength. She kind of had to in order to keep the family together. And when they lost their fortune, there really wasn't much reason for them to stay in Boston. So it was Nina's idea to at least come west. It wasn't necessarily Santa Barbara. They first started out in Paris, California. It's nothing like actual Paris, it's Paris. And it was population 300, and really, it's out in the desert, and it's hot. And actually, Hezekiah said, it's too darn hot, we have to leave. And so it's when Nina decided, well, we're going to go to Santa Barbara. So they did, they came to Santa Barbara, and then Hezekiah got the idea to become a miner in Colorado. And Nina wasn't thrilled because he left and left her in Santa Barbara with a population of about 6,000 people, with nobody, and two children, and her husband off being a miner. So she packed up the kids, and they moved to Denver. And I like that quote. That quote is actually in this little diary that she kept. And you can see how she just had tons and tons of writing in this little diary. And, she showed her strength and her power, and in a very gentle way. So the mining situation didn't quite work out, so they returned to Santa Barbara. And by that time, Pearl had been to Denver West High School for a year in a class of 125. And she comes back to Santa Barbara, and there's only like 24 kids in the senior class, junior senior class. And suddenly she's like more sophisticated than everybody else. And she had something where she was sort of like, well, let's call it big woman on campus. And she managed to get popular by deciding that the women should have a basketball team. And that's Pearl holding the basketball on her head. And she was the captain, the organizer, and the star player. She broke her nose twice playing basketball. And she was also the literary editor of the high school magazine, and the picture of her is on the in the yearbook is on the lower right with the ponytail. And she already seemed to have had some ideas about boys. And she wrote in their, they have like the dedication. I'm Pearl Chase, worried to death by the boys and their constant visits. Decided to live forever a bachelor maid, and dying, leave those said boys to anyone who wishes them. Don't all speak at once. Well, and the poor unfortunate young man there, William Shedd, had an absolute crush on Pearl for like 20 years. He loved her, and he was always sending her love letters, and she just couldn't find the time for him. But he went off to college and kept writing to her, and she had no use for him. But she did go to UC Berkeley after she graduated from Santa Barbara High, and she had to wait a year because she wasn't quite old enough, so she joined in 1905, and she was the class of 1907, and she joined the Kappa Alpha Theta. They didn't call them sororities in those days, they called them fraternities. So she joined the fraternity, was thrilled to be part of it. It provided her with a lot of grounding, a lot of social activities, and she was really connected with very wealthy young women from all over, mostly from the Bay Area. And Cornelia Stratton had a very huge influence on Pearl. She was 2 years older than Pearl was, and she kind of took Pearl under her wing. She wrote her a letter that I found in the files, and was very, very careful in loving the way she expressed it. But these 3 quotes, she cautioned Pearl that these were qualities that she needed to change. She needed to not be bossy. She didn't want people to get the idea that she was conceited. And then, aren't you just a little too anxious about boys? So I don't know what was going on with Pearl with the boys at UC Berkeley, but something was. And the really interesting thing, though, is I found this letter in an envelope, and the note that Pearl wrote on the envelope says, and it's in the upper corner, it says, "Connie's wonderful letter to a 17-year-old sophomore." So she took that advice to heart. It mattered to her. And the clipping is just one of Cornelia had come to Santa Barbara and stayed with the Chase family. And she was described as a charming girl who has been visiting Miss Chase for some time. They were close friends, and I think that was a real wake-up call for Pearl. You've all heard the most famous quote of Pearl's about how it was that she said, "I remember alighting from a train at the Victoria Street station, coming home from the holiday, and how ashamed I was of Santa Barbara's shabby buildings, dusty streets, and lack of landscaping. Then and there I resolved to make Santa Barbara a more beautiful place to live in." This was in the fall of 1907. But the context for that, I've always wondered about, what would make her a college sophomore? She was young. Why would what would influence her? Well, as it turns out, the center card there is an invitation to Pearl to attend an exhibit of the Architectural Association at the university. And that was held in December of 1906, 6 months after the earthquake. Pearl was in the earthquake in 1906, and you can see there's a lot of damage done to the Fairmont Hotel, which was actually designed by Julia Morgan. And 1 year to the day after the earthquake happened, it was in April of 1906, the Fairmont Hotel reopened, and it had been restored thanks to Julia Morgan. So here's my thinking. What I think is Pearl was on the train back and forth from Santa Barbara to Berkeley. She has time to think, and so she puts this together. This is my thinking, that on that trip home in 1907, on her holiday trip, she's thinking, San Francisco had this devastating earthquake and came back and rebuilt. And now I'm going back to Santa Barbara, and they don't even have an earthquake, and we could rebuild it. And guess what? There was a woman named Julia Morgan who was in charge. So that's my theory. That's what I'm going to stick with. And she knew Julia Morgan because she was in the same fraternity. So I just feel like, I don't know. That's my thinking of how a 17-year-old could care that much and have that big of a thought. Because the earthquake was a very big deal. Her freshman year was curtailed because of the earthquake, and they ended classes, and she helped deal with the aftermath. So Berkeley was kind of a balancing act for any woman who was there, because she was a good and serious student, and at least the thought was that most of the women were there to find a husband. And so in her scrapbook, which we have, the Pearl Chase Society actually obtained a copy of her scrapbook, she had many cartoons like this one, where it's like, the woman's hand is kind of getting at the guy. And there's another one called Betrothal Bay, and it has, it's like the women are there to get married. Clearly Pearl was not. But this little clipping on the corner is a clipping that says what to teach your daughter. And it's all kinds of values to teach a daughter. Teach her that 100 cents makes $1. Teach her to wear simple muslin dress, wear it like a queen. And teach her to have a place for everything and put everything in her place. It's just kind of lovely, and the fact that she clipped it and put it in her scrapbook was sort of meaningful to me as her thinking about what was to be in her future. So she graduated with honors in 1909. She had a degree in history, a minor in English, and she didn't know, as most college students do when they graduate, what do they do? What is it to do now? She's back in Santa Barbara, where there's a population of about 6,000. She's got a nice degree and nothing to do with it. And in her diary, she wrote that she was sitting on a bed, feeling disagreeable, strumming on her ukulele. I just love that idea of her. It's like Pearl Chase and a ukulele? That's very cool. So what did she do? Well, what do really good students do when they don't know what else to do? They go back to school, right? So she enrolled at the Santa Barbara Normal School, and that changed everything for her. She met Edna Rich, who ran the normal school, and she also, because every student at the normal school was required to take part in volunteer work at the neighborhood house that became the recreation center. She got to know Margaret Baylor as well. And so she did a lot of volunteer work and in the community, and it was as important to her, I think, as her studies were to become a teacher. She didn't want to become a teacher. That was never on her mind. But Edna Rich begged her to take the job, and she became a home economics teacher. And as she said, I cried. I didn't intend to teach, and if I did, it would have been history. And she said that she succumbed to Edna Rich's request. She hated teaching, but when you go through what she wrote about teaching and some of her curriculum, she did a really great job. She was as conscientious and careful and creative as anyone could be. She sent away for all these pamphlets. At one time, it actually made the papers because she sent to San Pedro and she got a case of tuna. And it was like, Miss Pearl Chase has a case of tuna for her students. And they had to, do something with that. And what she felt, though, about teaching was it involved a yearly repetition of nearly the same routine with very little chance for self-improvement. That wasn't helpful, and neither was the fact that she was hired for the magnificent salary of $1,100 a year. Her family needed the money, and she was kind of stuck. But she did it with grace, and I think probably what she didn't like was it was kind of proscribed. She had to follow what the administration wanted, and I don't think she liked that very much. Yeah, but she made a name for herself among the students because she gave a speech about why they did not need a dress code. And they voted and they agreed with her, so the girls didn't have to wear a dress code. Very cool. And then another tragedy. Nina was accidentally killed in a terrible car accident in the garage with Hezekiah at the wheel. And it was shocking of course, for the family, for the whole community. Most particularly, it threw everyone's life in the Chase family. It threw them upside down. Pearl was actually in Alaska on a camping trip when it happened, and Hal was in the Channel Islands. And Pearl wrote in her diary from Alaska that she was going to dedicate the rest of her life to taking care of her father. This was in 1913, and he lived till 1951. Yeah, so that was a big, big thing. The interesting thing is that the family came together. It didn't splinter apart. They came together better and better. And Pearl went back to work as a teacher, but hated every bit of it. And then in 1916, she was in a terrible car accident. And what she said was, when her father and her brother came into the cottage hospital room. She said, I never want to teach again. And they said, okay, fine, okay, because they both felt pretty guilty. I mean, Hezekiah, you can imagine, he's feeling terrible because it's a repetition of what happened to the wife, and Harold was at the wheel when they had this car accident. So what they decided was that Pearl would be the face of the Chase family in the community, and that Hezekiah and Harold would be her benefactors. They would pay for her economic needs, whatever it was. And so Pearl was very appreciative of this economic connection that they created. And as she said, that she had a peculiar and valuable independence, and that and very few men and women are free from that kind of restraint. She was always frugal. She didn't waste their money, and she was always conscious of what a gift it was for her. Because I've always wondered, you always read these articles and they always say, oh, Pearl Chase, she did all this wonderful stuff and then she never took a dime. I was like, well, how does that work? You got to give money somewhere. You can't just live on air. And so this is the kind of the secret that we don't talk about, but it turned out that this worked. And what happened was Hezekiah started a real estate company, and Harold was a very good businessman, and the two of them were able to reestablish the family wealth. And then Harold married a very wealthy woman, and that helped. Helped a lot. So here's one of Pearl's most wonderful friends. She was so lucky to have her. She was kind of a combination of a fairy godmother and a surrogate mother, and she was a travel friend. They were actually friends from 1900 until 1973. Alice Cooper Bence was the first neighbor that they had when they moved to Santa Barbara. She was actually married to Nathan Bence, who was a importer of Asian objects and fairly famous, and she left him, and they were divorced on grounds of abandonment. She abandoned him. She was quite the bohemian woman, and you can't really read this, but this is their itinerary for 1924. They took a tour of Europe together, and Alice kept a wonderful diary, and they started out in Liverpool, and they went to Scotland, and they flew over the English Channel in 1924, two women. And I just think that's quite remarkable. And they wrote about that. And they went to Paris, of course, and then on to Belgium and Amsterdam So it was a very long tour. There's a photo of Pearl on the deck during their European tour. But they were very, very close. Alice was somewhat older than Pearl, but she took good care of her, and she even gave her romantic advice. I mean, she kind of stepped in. She had been Nina's friend, but then she stepped in to help when Nina died. So this is just a little story about what happened in 1919. America got to celebrate on the 4th of July because the war was over, the pandemic was over, and it was finally a time where everybody could get together. And so in Santa Barbara, they had a huge 5-day kind of combination 4th of July fiesta, sports event. And Pearl, like many of the other women in Santa Barbara, was on the housing committee. And they kept they installed a bank of telephones at the recreation center. And Pearl, along with these other women, kept getting these phone calls from people that said, well, we want to have dinner in Hollywood and stay in Santa Barbara. And it's like, not in 1919, you're not doing that. These people had no idea where they were going or anything. They just knew they were coming to Santa Barbara. And this photograph of this tragic young man, this is Ralph Hyatt, the love of her life. And he sent her a postcard, and on it he said that he said, sorry, couldn't make fiesta, can't stand crowds. Well, I think that was kind of the death knell of that relationship. There were other reasons as well, but poor Ralph, he blew it. He really did. So anyway, so we hear a lot about housing these days. And Pearl did a great deal about beautification, social and cultural issues in Santa Barbara. But housing was very near and dear to her heart. And I always I like to share this quote because it's really important that we recognize this. And she said, this was in the news press, or the morning press it was at the time, "Several people have been interested in a project to provide a number of small, desirable cottages near the center of the city where people work, but the difficulty of building under present high prices has kept them from going ahead with the improvement." The year was 1920. Now, anybody could write that today, or they could have written it in the 40s or the 60s or now. So this is not a new issue in Santa Barbara. Pearl regularly encouraged people not to move here for the exact reason there just wasn't enough housing. And that was over time. And these are just two women that she worked with regularly. The recreation center was her center it was like the hub of activity in Santa Barbara. And she worked with Adele Herder in the Community Arts Association, particularly in the music program, and Frances Lynn, who established libraries, at the recreation center, and then eventually the public library. She worked on improving that. She was always the librarian involved. Another thing that Pearl helped lead but kept her name out of the papers was the campaign against wickedness at the recreation center. And you recognize that room. We've all been in there. And this was in 1919. And what Pearl probably forgot was how much she liked dancing when she was younger. She always had a full dance card. But what they were worried about was there was a proposal to allow dancing at the beach, and that was unchaperoned, and it was so open, and girls could get in cars, and there was a lot of concern about what was going to happen to the morals of the community. But what I found was interesting was it was the chief of police, and the reporters would always write that the recreation center, approves of chaperone dances. Her name was never associated with the campaign against wickedness. I just thought she's so clever. She's just so good. So this is another of her friends, Aurelia Reinhardt, president of Mills College. She got to know her as a social worker. Aurelia was she had children, and she was a very accomplished social worker. If you ever go to the East Bay, there's an actual park, a regional park named after her. And the two of them drove to the Tournament of Roses on the 1920 parade, and they went there together. So Pearl believed in person-to-person connection, and she made contact with a woman named Belle Breck, who was from Ojai, who had been running what they called was an international hut for soldiers in Vladivostok, Russia. And she came to Santa Barbara, to the recreation center, and gave a talk about what was happening after the Russian Revolution and how displaced so many people were. And Pearl was very interested in this, and went and met with Belle in her home in Ojai, and learned about a family of two women and a little girl who were from Vladivostok, who fled to Milan. Both of their husbands were killed, and they were basically starving. They had nothing, and Belle did not have the means to support these women. But Pearl decided to make them her cause. And so you can see there's a postal receipt for money that she sent, and she also got her good friend, a wonderful philanthropist who lived across the street, to Mr. William Bingham, and he helped, and he ended up paying for these women. He paid for the little girls' schooling. They took care of them. It was like person-to-person diplomacy, and it was just wonderful. And it's like this whole trove of letters back and forth and back and forth. And of course, the women were always writing to her about what an angel on earth she was to help them. And she, as far as I can tell, she never met them. It was just correspondence, but she probably saved their lives. So that was a pretty interesting influence in her life. So Pearl traveled frequently to Washington, D.C. because she was a conservationist at heart. She started the California Conservation Council in 1935, and one of her best friends that she met through this was Harlene James, who was she worked for the American Planning Association, and she was also the secretary of the National State Parks Council. And they would travel together to national parks. And they went to the desert Southwest, they went to Zion and Bryce and New Mexico, and then they took another trip in 1941, and they went to the Badlands and the Grand Tetons, but they traveled like these two women in these cars, and like 1941 was not a great time to be traveling, and they did it anyway. And then Harlene is very well known, and she wrote this book called the Romance of the National Parks, and that's kind of her press photo on the lower with it. It's on the lower left here, yeah. And then she came to Santa Barbara and had fiesta with Pearl one time. So Pearl often had these people stay with her. Patricia Montfort was her secretary. And she was quite a remarkable woman. She and Pearl were about the same age. She had lived in Europe and been a nurse during World War I. She actually rescued bodies from the battlefield at night, and she was an incredibly brave woman. She was just remarkable. She was married to an artist named Alfred Montfort. She wrote children's books. I mean, she was just like this amazing woman that, she and Pearl just connected. But after her husband died, she was in Los Angeles, and she moved to Santa Barbara, and she ended up working for Pearl as a caregiver for Hezekiah. Mostly a caregiver, but then Pearl realized that she could also be a secretary, and so she worked to death as a caregiver. She'd have pages of tasks that she needed to do for Hezekiah's care, and then in the afternoons she would go be a secretary for plans and planting, and the two of them became very good friends. And then when Hezekiah died in 1951, Pearl was able to trust Patricia with running the office, so she was able to leave a lot more. And Patricia seems like the same kind of mindset that Pearl did. She was a little cranky, and she wasn't afraid to tell people off in letters. And she ran a tight ship, and she was really responsible for running the Conservation Council and also the Indian Defense Association that Pearl had started. And basically that one was just the two of them sending off supplies and gifts to Native American population that was in dire need. So these two, and she also ran the garden tours for Pearl. So they were very close, and Pearl was pretty well devastated when Miss Montfort died. I think it was in like 1967. She was just shocked. So it was sad. And another good friend was Ganawalska of Lotus Land. And even before Lotus Land was what it is now, in the 50s, she opened up the property for garden tours for Pearl. And they had a nice correspondence with each other. They kind of really understood each other. They both had such different lives. I mean, Pearl was never married, and Ganna had 5 or 6 husbands, but they were like, both of them ran things. They were strong, and they really didn't care what people thought of them. And then this wonderful letter that Pearl wrote to her, and it's very poignant at the end of their lives. You have made the plans and given the orders all these years. You must now decide and agree to pay someone else to run the show, even if you don't like what's happening. Both of us are the kind that hate to be lame and hurting. I think that's just so poignant and just so touching. And yeah, so they had a very lovely relationship. And very shortly after I did the Dinky book, somebody gave me this photo of the two of them together. And I'm like, oh, man, I really would have liked it in the other book. But finally, here it is. Okay, so in 1942, Pearl started something called the Scorpio Club. And it was limited only to women who were Scorpios. And We have any Scorpios here? Yay, we should start it up again. So, and it started out as just a let's have lunch. Let's have lunch. And for the first couple of years, that's what it was. And then she got the idea to make it much more organized. And you can see from 1944, there were like a dozen members. And then how it grew until 1978. And it with all the roster and the dates and everybody's so organized. Because Pearl couldn't just do something halfway. It couldn't be, let's just go to lunch. It had to be, we have to bring a gift. We have to bring a cake. We have to tell everyone, what did you do for Santa Barbara this year? And the whole motto was to work and to serve. So Beverly Jackson took it over after Pearl died. She was, I think she was a Scorpio by just a couple days, and so that made her pretty happy. And she wrote a wonderful story for Santa Barbara Magazine where she talked about they changed from serving tea to serving champagne after Pearl was gone. But she wrote about this one time that they had a meeting, and this gust of wind just blew through the room, and they all just swore it had to be Pearl. So I think it's pretty cool that they had the Scorpio. I think we ought to have that again. There's something about, they're very determined and very hardworking, and, maybe you guys can start it. We can't talk about Women's History Month without talking about women's suffrage. And Pearl played it straight down the middle. Her good friend, Carolyn Hazard, was anti-suffrage. And her friend, as we saw before, Aurelia Reinhardt, was a very pro-suffrage. And Pearl did register to vote in California in 1912, when women obtained the right to vote here in the state. And in 1920, in February, so this would have been before the 19th Amendment was ratified, this clipping, Pearl is actually referred to as a suffragist. I don't know how she felt about that, because again, she tried to keep her personal point of view and personal out of the public eye. She was really good at that. I think we could all learn something from her on that one. I certainly could. But anyway, she was friends with V. Oburn and Sue Higman, both of whom have in their oral histories that they believed that Pearl was, definitely in support of the women's right to vote, and also in favor of the ERA. And when she heard about the work of feminists, the quote is that she said, "Good for them." So, I think that she felt maybe that she didn't need like a stamp of approval. She just needed to do the work. Yeah. And of course, Plans and Planting was her platform from which she worked. And she was lucky enough to be the quote-unquote secretary of Bernard Hoffman, who came to town, and the two of them had an amazing working relationship together from like 1920 until he was basically run out of town in 1927. And Pearl says nobody else really wanted the job, but the truth is nobody could have done the job. But she has this quote that I know doesn't apply to any of the men in this room. So she said, always get a prominent man to head it up, and then you do the work, but see that he gets the credit. Now, I don't think that Bernard Hoffman needed that, but I think that she was very smart in how she worked. And she, like I said, she ran this from 1927 until 1973. They disbanded. So her whole adult life, this was her platform for beautification, for signage, for cleanup. Everything was under the auspices of Plans and Planting. In 1973, Pearl got an award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And she went to Washington, D.C. in the middle of Watergate. And she was supposed to just be handed the award from Mrs. Nixon and say thank you and go back to her seat. But she grabbed the mic and she decided to talk instead. And she spoke for a few minutes and then talked about how proud she was of Mrs. Nixon. And this made the national papers. It was in the Washington Post. It was picked up by the Associated Press, and the story went around the world. And so Pearl was she was very kind. She had a big heart, I think, and she understood the pressures that the First Lady was under. And Pearl goes to Washington. A few famous correspondents with Pearl. We've all heard of, and again, I committed, I don't think I said this, I committed to going through all the boxes of her personal correspondence, which, hundreds of them, and I just felt that that was where I was going to learn about her, not just her work, but who she was as a woman. And so I would come across these letters, and you can see, here's a letter here from Pearl S. Buck, and basically she was thanking Pearl for all the kindnesses. Pearl had helped her get her lodging at the Biltmore, and given her flowers, and they'd gone on a picnic, and they had a lovely time, and she was thrilled to be in Santa Barbara and couldn't wait to come back. And then Lady Violet Astor was the mother-in-law of Pearl's niece, Barbara. And they were friends from the time that Barbara was married until Lady Violet passed away. And they corresponded over the years. And there was a letter from 1941, where Lady Violet was very pleased to have received what was it called? Boxes for Britain. And it was like a care package that came from California, and she said she felt like it came from her daughter-in-law. And then this letter, she was thanking Pearl for arranging a trip to Yosemite. So they were friends, and this was in 1961. They were friends for a good long time. And this, I hope you can see this well. This is correspondence over the years from Alice Cooper Bence. And like I said, they were friends for over 70 years. And you can see this one letter in 1924, and then how her handwriting changed by 1971 when she was 100 years old. She lived to be 102. So, and everything most satisfactory, wish I could see you, home after the party. And for her I was going to show you this one letter that she did, but for her 99th birthday, she made big 99 and put little candle flames on top of the 99. It was very cute. She was just this extraordinary bohemian, wonderful woman, I think, who helped Pearl lighten up a little bit. And then we're kind of into more modern times, and Pearl worked on, kind of her last battle is what I call it, was when they defeated the El Mirasol 2 9-story condo project that is on the site now where Alice Clark Memorial Gardens is. And my friend Penny Davies, who ran the Earthling, she worked with Pearl on that. And I was hoping she'd be here tonight, but she wasn't able to come. And then some of the other Pearl's girls were Vivian Oburn, who was very generous with me when I was writing the first book, and she provided me with a lot of resources that were in her files. And Sue Higman worked very closely on the Douglas Family Preserve. That's what she's best known for. And Nancy DeLabra was actually a flower girl in the Fiesta, and was just committed to Pearl's work. And I don't think Ms. Days is here. But Miss Days is still with us doing the good work. Yeah. Now, Pearl might not have been a part of the California Women's Museum exhibit, but she is a part of the International Women's Honor Quilt. And this was inspired by Judy Chicago and her work, The Dinner Party. There's an actual quilt that has like 1,000 of these triangles in a quilt. And in the early 80s, after Pearl had just passed away, 3 women from Santa Barbara worked together, and they created this quilt triangle. And they were moved by what they say what they created was her spirit, inner drive and vision, the inspirational force that created beauty out of chaos after the earthquake. And I'm really happy to be able to show this in color because it's so pretty. And Pearl kind of deserves to be with some of these other, big, important women. And these are just some medals that are in the collection at UCSB, and sadly, I wish they were on display. But she was awarded, countless various awards, and this one is from the Garden Club of America, one from California Beautiful. And as she always said, don't develop something ugly when it's no more effort to develop something beautiful. I love these. They're so pretty. And then the California Historical Society, the city of Santa Barbara. And as she said, every community is bettered if its citizens will cooperate in discussions and planning its present and future. So we need to remember that she encouraged individuals to express themselves and to join together into organizations and have a voice so that the politicians didn't run everything. That was a big, big important thing to her. And then I don't know who, this is not attributed, but someone said this at her memorial service. One wonders whether Pearl Chase will ever be satisfied with heaven after leaving her beloved Santa Barbara. And maybe she's up there, rearranging things or putting red tile roofs or I don't know what. Okay, there you go. Thank you.